Welcome everyone to this month's edition of Community Talks. We are very happy to host another edition, and we are also very happy with this month's speakers. We have a very exciting topic. The researchers that we have invited today are from Mzumbe University in Tanzania and the University of Antwerp from Belgium, and they will present their joint action research project on a human rights-based approach to health challenges associated with child marriages in Tanzania. We have our speakers, Professor Serafina Bakta from Mzumbe University, we have Professor Gamze Edem Türkeli from the University of Antwerp, and we have Professor Wouter van den Holle from the University of Antwerp as well. And I think that's all there is for me to say. Once again, thank you everyone for being here. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. Very pleased to see you here. As we were already introduced and the topic was introduced, I will just briefly give you an outline of what we would like to share with you today. But first of all, of course, let me thank you also, the representatives of Vleeg US, for giving us this opportunity to share this, the findings of this research project and also the further plans on this topic that we have. So basically what I would like to do is that I will give in a minute the floor to Professor Serafina Bakta to present the key findings of the research, after which I will introduce the underlying human rights framework from which we have looked at the topic of early marriage or child marriage. And Professor Gamze Edem Türkeli will then share with you some of the key outputs and also the follow-up plans that have already materialized, I must say. And then the idea is that we have plenty of time still for Q&A. So without further ado, I'm now happy to give the floor to Professor Serafina Bakta, just saying that Tanzania, we think, is an interesting and an important country to study when it comes to child marriage, given the high prevalence rates and within the country. And there is quite some diversity, with some of the regions having more than 50% of child marriage prevalence rates. For us, beyond the focus on the action research, beyond the question also of how to, in a way, strengthen a human rights-based approach to health challenges associated and with child marriages in Tanzania, it's also been an invitation for more fundamental and conceptual reflection on the way we conceive child marriage abolition strategies and the way they are implemented. And so that will also be part of what we would like to share today with you. And now, without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Professor Serafina Bakta to present the key findings of the project.
Very much, Professor Wouter. And the communication, I think, is a bit fluctuating, but I hope you are going to hear what I'm presenting. And I will focus on main or key findings from the empirical study. The main research question for our study was, how can a human rights-based approach be employed to address health challenges associated with child marriages? And then we have sub-questions, that is specific questions, where we examined what are the strategies and approaches that are in existence to address child marriages, and why does child marriage persist in Tanzania? And then we had another question, what are the health challenges associated with child marriages? And then the last question was, what are the strategies and approaches that can be used to address child marriages in Tanzania? So these were the questions, and in fact, they are going to be the outline for this presentation. Next slide, please. Next. So we started addressing the current strategies, what exists in Tanzania in relation to child marriages. We found that we have existing legal framework in terms of various legislation, including the Law of the Child Act, Education Act, and the amendments there too. We have policy framework and also that about child marriages. We also found that Tanzania has ratified and it implements international law obligations, being a dualist legal system. It has ratified, not only ratified, but it also through including, of course, it ratified the Convention on the Right of Child, the African Children's Charter, just to mention social welfare officers, community development, officers and parasocial workers. These and other related aspects. I think I was cut off.
Yes, you're back now.
But I can proceed. So we have child protection committees. Of course, in some places, they are not being established all over the, but we have child committees all over the country. Importantly, also Tanzania has a police gender desk. This is a desk that has been established as a specific unit within the Tanzania Police Force to deal with child and gender-related issues. So child marriages, violence, and other issues are dealt with by this policy-specific unit. Next slide, please. So one may ask that while we have all these strategies, while we have this legal framework, we have measures, programs, and we have other measures being put in place, why does child marriage persist in Tanzania? There are quite various reasons, and what I'm putting forward here is just the key reasons that, or drivers that we identified. One was poverty, and it was found that parents will marry off their children in order to get a bride price. And in some communities, this is quite huge amount of, it could be money or cattle or something like that. So it is something parents expect to gain when they marry off their children. And also the question of clear, and this is because we have scarcity of resources in some places due to climate change, and this is very obvious, and therefore young men would like, or even men would like to get married to someone who will assist in some activities. Of course, this is also related with gender roles. For instance, in African communities context, it is not expected for men to wash clothes and maybe do other domestic chores. So it is a responsibility of men. So this is this need increases as we have the climate change, which one of the effect it has caused scarce of resources. And the other, which is regularly mentioned by respondents, was customs and tradition. And in customs and tradition, we find that it is a family pride for African families to marry off their children. It is from that marriage they are expecting their children to to also get children out of that marriage, because in an African context, marriage is quite associated with getting children. In some cases, you may find a break up of marriage only because the parties were not able to get children. And this is quite influenced by even the whole family, because marriage in an African context, it is not only about two parties who are entering into marriage contract. It means also families, the uncles, and so on, and the aunties and the other people. So it is also, according to customs and tradition, it is meant to prevent premarital sex. What they believe is that if young girls stay longer without being married, they will end up getting children out of wedlock. So for them, it is a kind of a shame, and they don't want to go through such experience. So they think that it will be better to marry off their children while they are still young and before they are going into premarital sexual intercourse. And then the other aspect related to tradition and customs was gender roles and patriarch system, which I have mentioned. Men are encouraged to get married so they get someone to assist them, because it is not expected for men to do domestic chores. It is not expected, for instance, for men to fetch firewood, which is also related with climate change, because one of the experiences we are having through climate change is that people will need to walk long distance to get fat. It becomes a child marriage, because you find that most of those relate to those who educated. So for them, it's something. And then we have also gaps in legal framework. We found that the Law of Marriage Act itself creates some challenges because it sets the minimum age for marriage for girls at 15 years old, and for boys it's 18. And also, according to the very same provision, that is Section 13 of the Law of Marriage Act, with the leave of the court, then if one of the parties has attained 14 years, then the court may grant a leave for marriage. And the other aspect also is on legal pluralism. If you go back to the history of enacting the Law of Marriage Act, you see that it was intended to accommodate legal pluralism. There are questions of customary law, there are questions of Islamic law, and if you look at them, you see that marriage is accepted when the parties have attained, especially the girl has attained the age of puberty. So this was also, the age was accommodated in the Law of Marriage Act so as to accommodate the aspect of legal pluralism. And that is why you will find out that, for instance, the Court of Appeal of Tanzania has delivered a judgment in the case of Rebecca Gyumi, and asked the government to set the age of marriage at 18, but then the government has asked the community, it has asked the community to give their feedback, to give their opinion on whether they accept the age of 18 as issued in the case of, as directed in the case of Rebecca Gyumi. But you can still see the sense that the government aims at accommodating the aspect of legal pluralism. The next slide, please. So health challenges, this has been documented in various research. Of course, we also verified this in our research, that there are quite a number of health challenges that are associated with child marriages. And these include difficulties in during delivery. And in some cases, it may lead to death. And in sometimes kind of disease, for instance, fistula has been mentioned regularly, and so on and so forth. And then we have also the aspect of psychological effect. And this also gives the rise to child labor and street children, and also it creates a poverty vicious cycle. For instance, in our study, we found that these young girls who give birth to, who are married and then they are divorced, if we can call it a divorce, or if their relationship break up, they then go to find other means of surviving. They will go maybe to town to find some jobs and so on, and they leave their children with their grandmothers. And you find those children are not able to go to school in some cases, and they are not provided with basic needs, so they lack education, and apparently they will also end up in the same cycle of child marriages. And we are now proposing, having seen that we have legislation, and it is as if the legal framework in its own is not properly working. We propose to employ the human rights-based approach, which we are used also interchangeably with child rights-based approach. And basically, this approach requires to have a marriage at 18 years. And to achieve this, to achieve the human rights-based approach, you need to have a legal framework. In that matter, you need to legislate the age of marriage at 18 years, but also you need to take into account the best interest of the child. And this is the key principles. If I may say, you need to take into account all the principles, but the best interest of the child is in its own an umbrella principle, if I can say, because it requires in all actions concerning children undertaken by anyone, organization, institutions, government, parliament, they have to take into account the best interest of the child. And then it will require participation of children. And this is always a problem in an African context. I understand the background the African system has, and children are normally not involved. They have a valuable contribution to make. But then we need to engage and we need to involve children in decision-making and take into account their views as well. And we also need to employ the principle of non-discrimination, and we need to employ to implement the right to life, survival, and development. And also it has to ensure accountability of the state, because this is a duty bearer. And these principles, we are saying, are articulated in the CRC, in the African Children's Charter, and they have been domesticated in the Law of the Child Act of Tanzania. So it is not something that is new, that is being introduced or being imposed, but it's something that needs to remind us just to implement these principles, so as to ensure that the proposed human rights-based approach is being implemented. So this is all about our findings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bakta. So the idea is that I now give you a bit more detail on the underlying framework, legal framework, human rights framework, and some of it has already been touched upon. But so what we see is that in the human rights and children's rights framework, both at national and regional level, that the focus is very much on the abolition of child marriage or early marriage, both from the perspective of women's rights, where we have an international treaty on women's rights, but also an additional treaty, the Maputo Protocol to the African, so the regional human rights instrument. And so the key idea from a women's rights perspective is that one needs to clarify the minimum age of marriage, which is set at 18 years very clearly in the African regional instrument. If you look at the children's rights perspective, the initial entry point to early marriage, to child marriage, is a bit hidden. If we look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, what we see is that there is a provision that obliges states to take appropriate measures in order to abolish traditional practices that are prejudicial to the health of children. Hence also our entry point in this project, this action research project, to focus on the health of children as a consequence of early marriage, of child marriage, because that's the way it's been conceptualized initially in the children's rights framework. But there is a committee that monitors this Children's Rights Convention, and that committee has then clarified that one of those practices that may be prejudicial to the health of children is indeed early marriage, and that any marriage below the age of 18 is to be considered a forced marriage and therefore unacceptable. And this is also very much still the conceptualization we find in the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the targets says that states want to eliminate all harmful practices. So it's that same language of traditional practices, harmful practices, and their child early forced marriage are mentioned as examples. Again, what we see is that at the African level, in the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, that we get more explicit language, and where it is explicitly said from a children's rights perspective that child marriage must be prohibited, that states must take effective action, including legislation to prohibit it, and that the minimum age of marriage is 18 years. So in that sense, there seems now to be a very clear, bright line that the minimum age for marriage is 18 years, and so that every marriage in which a child, technically, legally speaking, a person below the age of 18 is involved, needs to be prohibited, both from a women's rights and a children's rights perspective. In the academic debates, what we see is that there are at least 3 themes that are being discussed. And so I'm now taking you to a next level, moving away, further away from the empirical findings that we had in the research undertaken in Tanzania, moving away also from the legal provisions to what are some of the underlying debates that we need to engage with. One is that question, is there a fixed age, a clear, bright line age that needs to be applied to talk about child marriage, early marriage that is then to be prohibited? And it's clear that we are moving more and more into the direction of 18, as I just illustrated, with the monitoring bodies of international treaties, both children's rights and women's rights treaties, being very clear that henceforth no dispensation, for example. So in exceptional circumstances where a judge can give dispensation from a lower age is possible in the future. So there is a clear, bright line as far as age is concerned. Another question is, but how do we go about that chronological age of 18, and should we not acknowledge that there are different childhoods and understandings of childhoods in different parts of the world, and so that 18 perhaps does not capture in all societies the transition from childhood to adulthood. And so there is that discussion on agency and maturity of children, and whether one should not look rather at their maturity and the degree of agency they have rather than at their chronological age. Some of the voices in that debate will argue that there can never be real agency in the context of early marriage, because girls, predominantly girls, are typically forced by circumstances. And one of the circumstances very much highlighted is poverty, economic deprivation, but also social norms, gender norms. And all these circumstances, it is then argued, exclude, in fact, that any agency is held by children. Other authors, other voices in the literature will rather diversify and distinguish between thin and thick agency, but still argue that the level of agency, the level of autonomous decision-making in a way that children below the age of 18 have is rather an example of thin agency or tactical agency, and so still constrained. And therefore, it is questioned whether there can ever be enough agency or maturity accepted below the age of 18 by many voices in the debates. And a third, even more conceptual issue, And legal issue also is the question of legal capacity and whether a person below the age of 18 is able to give free consent. And again, you have, on the one hand, voices who would exclude any free consent to be possible below the age of 18 because of lack of maturity, and others who would draw analogies either with ages set for consensual sex, which tend to be lower than 18. And so the argument would be, if you can freely consent to having sex as a person of 16 years old, why would you not be able to consent to marriage, for example? Yet others draw parallels with the approach taken in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where the starting point is there is legal capacity, except for those circumstances where legal incapacity is proven. So there's a presumption of legal capacity. And again, some would argue that could also work in this context. So just to show that if we try to understand what a human rights-based approach to early marriage could be in the vernacular, in a contextual way, that different options are on the table, and that there is quite some debate, so that the whole idea of straightaway abolition is a prominent one, certainly in all intervention strategies, but there is also the realization that abolition does not seem to work as an approach in itself, be it through prohibition, be it even through criminalization. The reality is that the prevalence rate of child marriage is not going down, but it's going up, as 2023 reports produced by, for example, UNICEF again show. So for us, the question is then, what else should be added? And this could be framed in an approach where we say, let's at least humanize, in a way, for the time being, the approach to early marriage, in the sense that whenever it's prejudicial to the health of young people, that then it should be strictly prohibited and measures should be taken to exclude it. And others have suggested and gone a bit further even and said, well, we need a contextualized approach. If we want to properly engage with customs and traditions, with social norms, that will not be successful if we only focus on abolition, or if we limit ourselves to those instances where child marriage, early marriage is prejudicial to health. But there we need to go beyond that and in a way vernacularize, contextualize the international and regional human rights framework. But there, the challenge is really how far you can go in vernacularization. And so if you go too far, then the standards and norms become very blurry, which has been called hybridization. If you stay very close to the legal framework and you replicate it, there seems to be quite some evidence that those approaches are not very successful. And so that's also the kind of the meta level at which we have learned from this research project, and that has taken us further down than in our future work. And so now happy to give the floor to Professor Gamze Erdem Türkeli.
Thank you very much, Professor van den Holle. So I'll speak about our key outputs, and one is really what is the next step forward. So we do, well, I'd like to remind you that when we started this project, we didn't know, of course, the COVID pandemic was going to hit. In fact, when we had the lockdown, Professor Bakta and her team members were in Antwerp. We were having the inauguration of our project. We were having really substantive trainings on methodology. And then, of course, we had the lockdown and the years that followed. So we did do this research constrained by some of those factors, which then I will explain as challenges, but we did set out to contribute to policy, as I think Professor Bakta really clearly set out and said, well, there are some policy initiatives that need to be taken. Of course, community-based outputs and academic outputs, as all of us are academics. So the policy outputs were really targeting decision makers, but also decision makers not just at the very high level, but also at the local levels. And we were focusing on health challenges linked to child marriages in this project. So there was a really close attention paid to social workers and healthcare workers in different regions, and the sort of the policy that was made around healthcare and social work. And so a training manual and dissemination seminars with those stakeholders. We launched a mobile application. In the next slide, I will show you what it looks like. Of course, the training manual then is meant to train not just social workers and healthcare workers, but also to guide sort of conversations with the communities about why child marriages, early marriages are happening, how can they be addressed, what the root causes are, and how those could be tackled. And again, one-on-one contacts and dissemination. And the academic outputs, we are working still on our academic publication and have had the academic dissemination seminar. I think there was a picture of it. And maybe in the next slide, then I could show you this mobile app, Tokomeza, that has been developed. And so if you were to go on the App Store, Android App Store, you could find this app. Of course, as I mentioned, we had to work in the context of a pandemic. So we're the challenge, of course, is to make it more widespread and used. And that's actually going to be one of the goals going forward with this app, to make sure that people who are in the field working on the ground with communities know and are able to benefit from this mobile application. The next slide. And so that brings me, and I'll try to keep it short so we can have a discussion with the questions that are coming in the chat. But with our experience from this project and the findings that Professor Bakta shared with all of us this morning, we thought, okay, our work isn't done. We've identified some of the key drivers, the health challenges, but we also, the research also showed that there's a lot of those drivers that are going to be exacerbated by climate change, environmental challenges, so the socioeconomic and environmental risk factors for child marriage would be exacerbated. So we thought maybe in terms of that vernacularization of different norms in the communities, we can take a resilience approach that rests on empowerment. And in this context, we do have also not just legal scholars, but social work experts who form a part of this consortium for this new project that's called Re-Empower. It's a 5-year follow-up project that is a VLERI-US Teams project, and it's called Resilience Through Empowerment, Overcoming Socioeconomic and Environmental Risk Factors for Child Marriage in Tanzania through a Positive Engagement with Customs and Traditions. It started last September, so the beginning of the academic term, and it's going to last until the end of August 2027. Next slide. And so I could maybe try to present it in a step-by-step way. Our point of departure, of course, is the research, the key academic outputs of the Early Marriages Project, the mobile app, the training manuals that we have. And we thought, okay, we have these outputs from this first project, but how can we enrich them with research on the impacts of climate change on child marriage to see what the drivers will be going forward as we are facing this climate crisis, but also to shift the lens a little bit, because we think of customs and traditions as enablers of early marriages, child marriages, but then we started questioning, could we do research on what positive role customs and traditions could play? Because we know that in that sort of vernacularization of norms into the communities and the acceptance of different norms that would empower children, girl children especially, to have fulfilling lives and have access to education and other opportunities that they want to pursue. Could we look for customs and traditions that could play a positive role and that the communities already embody within themselves? So those two tracks will be the research tracks. Those two streams will provide us further research and further findings to see how we can then employ the academic outputs from the first project. Of course, it also has component of training, further capacity building. And so we've, within the law faculty at Mzumbe University, to have that public outreach through, first of all, engagement with qualitative research methods by legal scholars who are there at the faculty, who would like to do research on not just child marriages, but other societally relevant issues. And then, of course, the second part is building teaching modules on gender and the law. So that is going to go further than just engaging with a number of policymakers, but that's going to really go deeper into training people who will be practitioners in this field. Maybe they won't be working on the issue of early marriages, but they will have that cognizance going forward in, for instance, maybe designing educational opportunities and so forth, and that they would have this awareness of gender and the law and how issues around gender impact the law and vice versa. And of course, we are hoping and planning to undertake this, the research stream with the communities in a community-based way. So both the research itself and the dissemination and awareness raising will be very much informed by being in connection with communities on the sort of long term, and also taking what we know from the previous project and building on it, and being able to provide policy contributions, especially in these two streams of research that we will do that haven't been really covered in literature in depth, especially with respect to the Tanzanian context, but more broadly also. So we hope that the research will really feed into designing policy and tackling the root causes and key drivers of early marriages that are harmful, in ways that will empower girls and women in communities to make choices, to be able to make choices, and for the communities to be resilient to those socioeconomic and environmental challenges. So I think I'll leave it there so that we can have a discussion with our audience. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Eremtje Kelly. And so, yes, that brings us to the Q&A. I noticed there are already a couple of questions in the chat. There's one question on a practical question on where the study is available, and perhaps Professor Bakta can say something about the availability of the study, certainly also the hard copy that is available, but perhaps also something more. So I'll perhaps give you the floor on this question.
Hello, can you just repeat your question?
Yes, so
Hello,
yes, Serafine, the question is where the study is available. And so I was saying that perhaps you can...
Hello, can you...
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Repeat.
I'm afraid this is not working, but so let me maybe share with you that there is a number of hard copies of the study that have been prepared and are available at Mzumbe University. And so I suggest people who are interested in a hard copy can reach out to Professor Bakta. We will also make sure that there is a soft copy available online, and perhaps there is a way of sharing soft copies with all the participants in this community talk. So we'll follow up on that. There is then a more substantive question, I think, on the suggestion that we need a holistic approach to solve this challenge, and maybe Professor Adam Kelly wants to say something about it, because that's, I think, part also of what we are trying to achieve with this 5-year Re-Empower project. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. I think we quickly realize, anyone who starts to study this issue quickly starts to realize that it's a multi-layered issue. The drivers are very different. They also are shifting depending on the circumstances. And so that's why we, just having an abolitionist perspective, as Professor van den Holle was explaining, saying this is prohibited, this is the age, it does not, well, it may make it illegal in a sense, but it's the implementation does not quickly translate from that abolition or that prohibition. And it might even make it harder for girls who are in those kinds of marriages to seek healthcare if they know for a fact that if they want to go give birth in a hospital setting, that this is going to cause criminal prosecution. Their families might not be really willing to take them to a hospital, and they might have even worse outcomes from childbirth and other types of physical burdens, let's say, at a young age of being in a marriage. And so there is a very delicate balance to be struck, I think, without enabling harmful practices and enabling perhaps decisions that are made without the agency of children and young girls and boys who are involved in child marriages. The idea is really to empower them, to show them that there are, to enable some choices that they can make, especially the research done in the context of our previous study, but also by others, show that a lot of girls might say, well, I would have liked to study, I would have liked to find a job, but there were no opportunities to study, it was too expensive. My family didn't have the socioeconomic means to allow me to study, perhaps, in the secondary education system and then tertiary education. So this was, I was then married off. So we are cognizant of the multidimensional nature of this issue. Of course, we don't promise easy solutions either. So we also realize we need to do more research to understand what might be going forward drivers, and also to understand how resilience might be formed in communities to not think of early marriages as the first solution that they think, we don't have the means to educate our daughters, then we will marry them off, to really show that there might be opportunities for resilience, even if the key drivers, the socioeconomic root causes are there. What else could be options within the community, and how perhaps existing customs and traditions could enable us to have that conversation. So that, we don't promise that in with the 5 years project that there will be the solution to this, of course not. But I think we will work towards combining those approaches that are built with the community. So we do have colleagues from Hogeschool Ghent who are experts in community-based social work and in working with communities in this respect. And the other partners are, of course, from law faculty. So we do have that tendency to say we should regulate it in law. And that's only one of the ways. So with this project, we're hoping that we move towards a more holistic engagement with the communities, not just to tell them this is the age, this is the legal, this is the law, but also to say, besides the law, beyond the law, there are good reasons for allowing children to have options and not for child marriage to be the option that you go to when you have economic hardship, that what might be exacerbated with climate change, especially with environmental degradation and dryness and droughts that we will be unfortunately experiencing. Scientifically, we know that this is going to happen, and it's going to happen sooner than later. So to have those conversations with the communities, hopefully, and of course the policymakers, not just the communities. So we're hopeful that this is going to be a value added in the context of this issue, but of course that with the awareness that it is a very, very difficult issue to tackle. And I think, all of the people that have been involved in research or policy know, and I think that there are some people in the audience who are indeed in the practice of this, and they know for a fact that it's a very complicated situation, which we also definitely agree with. And I would maybe, this is an open invitation, if you would like to be in contact with us during this new phase of the project, that it's an open invitation that you get in touch with us, and I'll put our emails, at least my email, in the chat. And we would very much like to work also with civil society actors, policymakers, in the context of this project, with the outputs that we have with the previous one. It would be wonderful to build more collaborations, and so this might be a good opportunity to launch maybe this call.
Thank you, Gamze. Professor Bakhta, I can see you now also on the screen. You seem to be back with us. There is a question on the role of, or a comment on the crucially important role of religious leaders in addressing the issue of child marriage. Perhaps you want to comment briefly on that, because as I recall it, when we were brainstorming on the follow-up team project, you came with that suggestion to focus on the positive, to study the positive role of customs and traditions, including religion, rather than only emphasize their potentially negative role in contributing to the persistence of child marriage. So please, you have the floor if you're happy to comment on that comment. Please don't forget to unmute yourself first. Thank you.
Thank you, Ota. I think as Gabs has responded, that if we want to identify the positive roles of customs and tradition in relation to child marriages, it is not something that we can just think about and say what role do they play. It is something that we need to engage with the communities, do a comprehensive research, and come up with the findings. Because otherwise we may have our own ideas, which are not necessarily the fact that we need to identify. So it is something that needs to be investigated, and it is only after investigation that we may be in a position to say whether there is really a positive role that can be played by customs and tradition, and which are those kind of positive roles of customs and tradition. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there is another question that you are best placed to answer, and that is that a colleague is flagging that in Tanzania there are these child protection committees, but that most of them have been inactive due to lack of funding. So the question, I think, if I understand it correctly, is that we should in a way also pay attention to the need for funding and for government support to allow those committees to do their work. But perhaps you can comment on that comment as well.
Yes, thank you for that very relevant question. I think what is being said is true. I did units of the issues that we have. So I think the comment is just valid, and I agree entirely that these committees are not well funded by the government, and maybe something has to be said now to in order to ensure that the committees are well funded so that they are able to function properly.
Thank you very much. There is another comment or position taken in the chat that on the one hand, early marriage in sub-Saharan Africa is very much an endogenous issue. It is argued or submitted, and on the other hand, that a human rights-based approach is kind of an exogenous issue coming from the outside, and so that may be a difficult match, if I understand and interpret the comment correctly. And yes, indeed, that is something we fully acknowledge. On the one hand, we believe we cannot ignore the fact that we have a human rights framework, a children's rights framework there, and countries in sub-Saharan Africa, states have ratified all these legal instruments. So we can't ignore that. On the other hand, we do realize that there is this need for what we have called vernacularization, using the concept introduced by Sally Engel-Mary on that topic, where she exactly has studied from a legal anthropological perspective what happens between, in a way, the having norms, international norms on women's rights, on children's rights on the one hand, and putting them into practice. And so there she has pointed out, on the one hand, the tensions that are there, that you have to navigate carefully, not to simply replicate these international norms, because then they are irrelevant by and large. On the other hand, that if you take the local circumstances too seriously in a way and contextualize too much, that you may end up weakening, watering down the norms. And so she's, Sally Engel-Mary, the late Sally Engel-Mary has pointed out that there's a crucial role for what she calls then translators. So those who are bringing, in a way, these legal context to human rights-based approach to local communities, and where she argues that those translators should not come from the outside, but should be also people from within the communities, but that they are in a very difficult role. And so in that sense, I think for us, it's an open question that we will look into further in the coming 5 years, whether to what extent in such a human rights-based approach, when we have religious and local leaders and traditional leaders as part of the group of so-called translators, whether that can bring about part of the change that we are pursuing, namely that ideally no child marriages are taking place in line with these international commitments, but also without ignoring the circumstances, the push factors, the drivers that were flagged that lead to child marriage and even an increase in child marriage in many regions at this time. So let me see, we're, I think, moving towards the end. There's a comment on the need, I think, for a transdisciplinary approach. Perhaps Professor Adam Turkelly can say a word on that.
Yes, indeed. So I think we are also cognizant that we need a transdisciplinary approach that maybe even goes beyond the disciplines that we are including in this project, of course. And I think we know for a fact anthropologists, sociologists, in addition to lawyers, medical sciences, so experts in medical sciences, they also work, and we're very much in favor of coming together. And in fact, when we did the training, it was a medical doctor who gave us the qualitative research methodologies training in Tanzania, in Morogoro, in January of this year, because they do work on healthcare and community health, and they are, building this expertise. And so we are very open to, I think, transdisciplinary collaborations, and realize that every segment of society and every segment of society that is a stakeholder in this. So indeed, I think one thing that came out of the chat that I was trying to read is also, of course, the economic issue, that we are cognizant that there are resources that are needed, and it's a global justice issue with developing countries not having enough resources. And so we are cognizant of the background. Unfortunately, those are things that are systemic and about which we can't do much. But we are aware that a whole host of issues need to be addressed. In terms of climate, of course, we know that financing needs to be given to developing countries that will be experiencing the impacts of climate change much earlier and more severely. And I think some of us do work, in addition to this project and children's rights and women's rights, on those issues as well, outside the context of this project. But I really would like to underscore that I agree with this, that we need transdisciplinary approaches, bottom-up approaches that are going to capture a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different voices that could allow us to maybe find solutions to the issue in a community-based way.
Thank you very much. I think we are running out of time, so we need to wrap up. But I would like to acknowledge in a way, the further comments that show, one, the complexity of the issues, and there is a comment also on the importance of proper training of the police gender desk that was mentioned in the presentation, and also another comment that flags a project that has just started on sexual and reproductive health education, and how that is important. And so it shows that although the entry point is early marriage or child marriage, that in a way we touch on very structural issues in terms of poverty, climate change, and how they are drivers of early marriage, but also on, in a way, the network of actors that is relevant, and maybe so-called translators in the language we could use of vernacularization to bring about change, but also the complexity of bringing about change, and that is exactly what we hope to understand better through follow-up empirical research, and then also through further work. So I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you very much for your presence. Thank you very much to the colleagues, in particular also the colleagues from Zumbe University, Professor Bakta and the whole team there, both for the very fruitful collaboration, and also for your presence today again and your contribution today. Thank you also to my colleague from Antwerp, and thank you very much to VLEUS for giving us this platform, this opportunity to share also the research, to establish new contacts. We look very much forward to staying in touch with you, and we'll make sure also to share the information on where the research report of the previous project can be found. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walter.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. To finish it all up, we will make available the video of this session, so everybody can find it back on our website. If Professor Van den Holle wants, we can also put on our website the presentations, so people can look it up on our website, or you can leave it up to you and let people mail you, or we can discuss that between us, how we want to share the information. And yeah, next to that, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I thought it was a very good presentation from the three persons, Mr. Professor Van den Holle, Gamze Erdem Turkeli, and Serafina Bakta. So yes, thank you, and welcome for the next community talk, which is on 28th of June. Yes, it's about the sustainable rural development through socially innovative and community-based conservation in the Peru. So everybody's welcome to join that one as well. And I want to finish this session.